non notare, piacere, grazie. Non notare.
We're living through a monumental historical moment. It's unprecedented in all of history, in the whole history of the Church. A lot of things are happening in Rome and in the Vatican, and there hasn't been up to this point a whole lot of questions from people, from journalists, from churchmen, questioning the process, questioning what's happening, which seems a little odd to me, given the fact, again, that this is truly unprecedented. Chris Ferrara, is it not? What we see with the abdication of Pope Benedict, Pope Francis coming on, not living in the papal apartment, doing all sorts of things, sort of departing from the usual papal routine. And yet not a whole lot of people have been asking a lot of questions. Why is that, do you suppose?
Well, it's just another unprecedented day. We've been living through 50 years of unprecedented developments in the Church. What's another novelty? What's another change? What's another innovation? We just read a couple of days ago that the Pope Francis, the Vicar of Christ, head of the Vatican City State, has decided that he doesn't want all the fuss and bother that attend the travels of the head of a Vatican state and the Vicar of Christ, so he just applied for a passport under his former name, Jorge Mario Bergoglio. He insisted upon it, and he insisted on paying the $55 processing fee so that he could travel under his former name. Apparently he's uncomfortable with the idea that he is the head of the Vatican City State and the Vicar of Christ. And you speak about an unprecedented time in history. We have a bit of a paradox here. We have a pope who's uncomfortable being known as the pope, and we have a former pope, Pope Benedict, who's uncomfortable being known as what he was before, a cardinal. So he has retained the title, His Holiness Benedict XVI. He's held on to a papal coat of arms, which has the keys of Peter in it. He gave up the ring of the fisherman, but he still has the title, His Holiness. And he still has a coat of arms that reflects not the cardinalate, but the papacy.
Let me ask you two things, Chris. First of all, I want to get into your latest Remnant article, which is your translation of Sochi's, asking some very pertinent questions about this whole thing. But also, I noticed today that I think it's the London Independent, where there's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, a little bit of perhaps mockery coming into the media's perception or the media's take on this, specifically with this passport issue, where the London correspondent said, or Independent says something like the Pope is in his quest to show what an all-around great guy he is. He's got himself a new passport. So are we beginning to see maybe just a little bit of fatigue with this show that's going on in the Vatican at the moment, with the media, on the part of the media?
You mean the humility show?
The humility show, exactly.
Because that's what the press is now beginning to characterize it as. That's what the London Independent is talking about. They even talk about a public relations or publicity campaign of which this business with the passport is a part. And they're beginning to mock the idea that this reflects some kind of true humility in a man who's, let's face it, using the world stage to promote an agenda that has a lot of conservative Catholics quite upset. And he who lives by the media dies by the media. It's just a matter of time before they turn this sort of thing against him, and they're already doing it.
I want to give him any benefit of the doubt that we can possibly come up with. So can you think of a bona fide reason why this passport issue is an issue, first of all? Why is he doing this? Is there something that we're missing, perhaps, that this is a good thing? I'm scratching my head. I can't figure it out. Have you been able to come up with anything?
Well, it seems to me that we're dealing with a humility that is assuming titanic proportions. It seems that all of these little gestures, which are characterized as gestures of humility, somehow obtain immediately worldwide publicity. Yeah. We knew right away that he paid the $55. We knew right away that he was humbling himself, so to speak, by obtaining a passport and identity card under his old name as if he were just a regular guy. All of these developments are immediately trumpeted to the world, and that's not going to happen unless there's cooperation between the Vatican and the world media outlets.
Yes. It's
not the kind of thing that you would normally expect as a display of humility, something that is immediately and universally publicized.
It's funny because when he tried this the first time, and I thought it was sort of amusing, sort of funny when he went back after the conclave, and he insisted on paying for his own hotel room in Rome and so forth. And at that point, I thought it was kind of cute. It was sort of funny. But now the fact that sort of revisiting this, and by they I mean apparently the PR campaign for the Holy Father, revisiting these little things which seem to be stunts. And I know that if President Barack Obama did this or if Joe Biden did this, the media would certainly see through it, and I think they would mock it. And I'm just wondering if I think maybe they've gone back too many times, in other words, and maybe it just isn't working anymore.
Well, it's getting old, and the increasing absurdity of it is apparent even to the media that are trying to exploit these things, of course, to portray the humble Pope in sharp distinction with the previous Pope, who is the villain du jour, that terrible Pope, the German Panzer Cardinal who became Pope, and who dressed up in fancy vestments and loved the Latin Mass. He was an old fuddy-duddy, but here we have Pope Humble the First doing this, that, and the other thing, which indicate humility. This is the media's creation to a large extent. Unfortunately, the Pope is catering to it, and it's going to come back to haunt him. I think the media is beginning to see what is ultimately a bit of a ridiculous series of gestures when you consider who the man is. This is the Vicar of Christ. So, for example, he gets on an airplane with a torn leather bag, and everyone says, "Oh, look at the torn leather bag. He's carrying it himself." But he's getting onto a jet plane personally chartered for him to take him to a foreign country where, in the case of Brazil, was going to be a $28 million beach party just to celebrate his arrival in Rio. Now, if you're going to talk about humility, why not take that $28 million and distribute it to, say, 5,000 families who live in the shanty towns on the edge of Rio? That kind of money would change 5,000 lives permanently.
Yeah, that's
Brazilian
right.
economy. Why did they have to have this beach party? There was nothing humble about that spectacle.
No, that's it. And at some point, I guess there's some frustration that I'm feeling with the Vatican itself. That they, if some of this is media driven, why isn't the Vatican doing a better job? To this point, I'm only aware of one instance, and that was after the Rolling Stone interview, or the spectacle in Rolling Stone magazine, when Father Lombardi came out and said, well, it's really a shame that they tried to juxtapose the two popes to be critical of Benedict. And so what I wonder is why the Vatican isn't doing a better job to maybe minimize some of these stunts, these media stunts, in order that Benedict doesn't have to be, constantly compared to this guy, I'm sorry, to the Holy Father, who's engaging in this sort of thing.
Well, this is the problem. The popularity that he is now experiencing, which is an ephemeral thing, of course, it will end sooner or later, is coming at the expense of his predecessor. Doesn't he understand this? Don't those around him understand it?
Yeah.
He is being lauded only to the extent that he can be portrayed as, in some sense, detracting from his predecessor and denigrating the traditions of the church. Every single tribute to him sounds that theme. Look at this humble pope, as opposed to his prideful predecessor. Look at this open-minded pope, as opposed to the former Panzer Cardinal who became Pope. We went to have a new attitude of openness. All of this credit to the currently reigning Roman Pontiff comes at the expense of his predecessor and of the teachings of the Church.
Yeah, no, that's
He
it.
really needs to understand this if he doesn't already, and maybe take some steps to stop currying favor with gestures of this kind, which, by the way, for all their apparent humility, just cause problems for those who surround the Pope.
Yeah.
And increase the expense of operating the papacy in terms of travel and other things.
Isn't it fair to point out, too, that this has been going on for a long time? I mean, the media, since the Enlightenment, you could argue, since the French Revolution, when they actually physically took the Catholic king and queen and dragged them through the streets and chopped off their heads, have been trying to get the Catholic monarchs and the popes off the pedestals, off the thrones, and down into the streets with the regular folks, and it seems like we're seeing something similar. We're really, the Pope's popularity now and his skyrocketing popularity numbers are a result of the fact that he's kind of going out and slumming. He's throwing off the trappings of the great monarchical institution of the papacy, and he's becoming like us in a very egalitarian sort of way. We've seen this before, but it's not going to help the church. I don't see how it's going to serve the church, even if temporarily we have high approval numbers for the Pope.
Well, let's talk about the ultimate gesture of humility here, which is the series of actions by which this Pope has indicated that he does not consider himself a monarchical head of the church in the traditional sense. His coat of arms doesn't have the pallium, which has replaced the tiara as the symbol of governance in the church. He identified himself as the Bishop of Rome when he came out on the loggia immediately after his election. His first words to the Church Universal were, "Good evening."
Yeah.
I mean, it's been one thing after another to suggest that this is a man of the people. But when we see the word popular and pope in the same sentence, we should be worried, because the popular pope is not a pope who is going to be what Christ himself was. The God whose vicar he is was a sign of contradiction to the world. If the pope ceases to be a sign of contradiction to the world and becomes a popular pope, the salt has lost its savor and will be trampled underfoot. This is our Lord's warning.
Yeah, no, that's exactly it. And again, I'm certainly not trying to read his motives. Sometimes I feel, or judge him, I sometimes do feel that he came from South America. He's dropped into the middle of this cosmopolitan city to begin with, and then just the whole idea of being in the Vatican, being Pope, he's trying to adjust and put his own personality into it, and it just doesn't seem to be working. At least I don't think it's going to work for a whole lot longer. And maybe we're beginning to see the tide turn a little bit in this new piece that John Allen has just written for the Boston Globe, in which he's pointing out there are a number of people who are certainly not crackpots, who are asking a lot of questions. And this is the subject of your new Remnant article over at remnantnewspaper.com, where you translate Antonio Socci's new article. Tell us about that.
There's a couple of articles he did for Il Libero, an Italian daily, that he reposted on his website. And the theme of those articles is the suggestion that there is a serious canonical problem with the manner in which Pope Benedict resigned and the manner in which he has retained some semblance of the papal office with the apparent agreement of his successor, so that according to Socci, in a sense, we now have two popes, which is an unprecedented development, because although there were anti-popes in the past who contended with each other for the papal throne, sometimes as many as three at a time, as Socci points out, with reference to the great Western schism, never have there been two living men who in some sense are coordinate popes. And so we have Pope Francis tweeting the message that we should pray for His Holiness, Benedict XVI, a man of great courage and humility. What does he mean by humility? Was he humble because he stepped down? And Socci here explores the theme that maybe this resignation of the Pope, while exteriorly a freely willed act, he after all said so, I do this of my own free will, might have been the subject of interior compulsion, a conflict of will within the Pope himself. And Socci asks the question, and this is respectfully treated by John Allen in his article, he asks the question whether the Pope has actually resigned interiorly, or does he still in some sense consider himself to be a holder of the papal office? Yeah. Things said certainly indicate that.
And it's so important, Chris, as we consider these developments. First of all, John Allen is covering them. He's no traditional Catholic. He's a Vaticanista. He's a veteran Catholic journalist, been in Rome forever. The fact that he's giving any attention to this is pretty amazing. And then of Socci, he says, I think I got a little note here, he says, Socci, let's be very clear, is not, quote, is not a crackpot. This is a guy that's not only important in his own right among Italian journalists and the Italian press, but the fact that John Allen is covering this, I think, suggests that this story is beginning to get legs, this whole problem here.
I mean, not only does he treat it seriously, here's what he concludes, and I'm reading from his article. The Socci essay points to a plausible trajectory if right-wing backlash to Francis continues to mount. The Church could end up with a majority of Francis Catholics and an influential minority of Benedict Catholics. That may not quite add up to a schism, but it's still something to think about. That's a remarkable statement coming from John Allen, writing for the Boston Globe. He further says that Socci's piece is especially interesting, I'm quoting here, for its attempt to resurrect Benedict XVI as a rallying point for the discontented. Socci asks if Benedict may have resigned only in exterior fashion, meaning that in his heart he still regards himself as the pontiff. Now, Socci, in his article, quotes the Pope's own statement during his address of February 27, 2013, in which he says, "When I became Pope, it was always and forever." And then he goes on to say, with the always, there is a forever. And so while I may not continue to exercise the active ministry of the papacy, this forever is not revoked. I can never again, he says in the same address, simply return to the private sphere. So in some sense, Sochi says, what else could it mean? He says that he is in some passive sense, some inactive sense, still within the ministry of Peter.
Yeah, yeah.
And the phrase he used in his speech of February 27, 2013 was within the enclosure of Peter, which at the very least introduces a very perplexing ambiguity. And Sochi's piece describes the situation as, these are his words, almost apocalyptic.
And he didn't come to this just at the spur of the moment or even just post-abdication. He was on the record already, I think, months and months before the abdication as predicting that it was going to happen. So there were already in Rome, in Italy, movements, rumors, talk about the fact that Benedict was going to be abdicating, leading many, including Sochi, to speculate why.
Yeah.
Who were the powerful forces? What powerful forces were behind the throne, quote unquote, if you will, agitating for this? And it seems pretty clear, Chris, that at least without getting too conspiratorial, we can at least conclude that there must have been someone, some group, that wanted to see Benedict abdicate in a really, really big way.
Well, you know, the neo-Catholic quietists are about their usual business, which is telling everyone to go to sleep and nothing really wrong. Meanwhile, there are some serious questions. Why would a pope who is lucid, who is still in possession of his faculties, who can still walk, talk, grant interviews, and even write, say in advance, I intend to resign in my 85th year, as Sochi noted 2 years before the actual date of the resignation in a column he wrote in September of 2012. Why would he say in advance, I'm going to resign when I'm 85? What could possibly induce a pope to do this? What, he was tired? Clearly there was influence exercised by someone that contributed to that decision. And Sochi notes the fact that some of the cardinals involved in the 2005 conclave, violating their oath on the gospel, leaked to the press the diaries of the votes at the 2005 conclave, which revealed that, wouldn't you know it, the second place finisher was Cardinal Jorge Mario Bergoglio in 2005. This is the man they wanted. They came that close to having him elected. Then we find Pope Benedict resigning in the 7th year of his pontificate for no apparent reason. And who succeeds him? The number 2 man in the 2005 conclave, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, who now insists on being known by that name as he travels around the world.
You know, Chris, I think it's really important at this point because so many of our well-meaning neo-Catholic friends always and forever interject. At this point, you are questioning the workings of the Holy Ghost. You have no idea. You're just laymen. You can't even speculate like this. But isn't it important when you have discussions like this, if you look back in the history of the papacy, there have been some real wingnuts. There have been some terrible guys that got in. And to say that the Holy Ghost intentionally put them in for some reason, I mean, God allows these things to happen, but oftentimes, isn't it true, even something like papal elections happen in the natural order. And it's not like a magic trick done by the Holy Ghost in each and every instance. There is a strong human component here that can change history.
Well, again and again throughout church history, the papacy has been occupied by an absolute knave of one sort or another. Yeah. I would tell people who are watching this broadcast to get a hold of John Rao's book, Black Legends, which details the sordid history of the papacy, which in miraculous fashion has not been able to affect the deposit of the faith despite the failings of the individual members of the office. And that's the miracle of the church's survival, that in spite of bad men being elevated even to the throne of Peter, the church continues its mission and the deposit of faith remains intact. But this idea that whatever we get from a conclave is the direct, inspired will of the Holy Ghost is ludicrous. That's not even Catholicism 101. That's some sort of Pollyanna vision of the church. I think John Rao, in an article he just wrote, calls this the theory of the Pope as il supremo. We don't have a Pope who is il supremo. We have a Pope who, in his human nature, is fallible and operates within the limited charism of infallibility, outside of which he can make the same kind of mistakes as any layman can make.
yeah. And to say otherwise, doesn't that sort of feed right into what our friends, the Protestants, have been saying for 500 years? Not rightfully so. I mean, in other words, the accusation has always been that we worship the Pope, that we attribute all these almost semi-divine attributes to him and so forth. And it's almost as if now the neo-Catholics are confirming that, in a sense, when they behave this way about the Holy Ghost's role in conclaves, or the fact that the Pope is always and forever above any sort of criticism, which is another confusing factor. We have a lot of neo-Catholics that will criticize bishops all day long, Chris, but what is the Pope if not the Bishop of Rome? It's always scandalous to criticize the shepherd. It's always something loyal and faithful Catholics should shy away from, if at all possible. But this huge distinction, and we're in the middle of a crisis now, but it's okay to criticize bishops, but don't you ever say anything about the Holy Father. Of course, this too is something of a novelty.
I forget which senator, I think it was the Pope, it might have been Leo XIII, better that scandal should occur than that the truth be hidden. Because the truth is what is most important in the end. And the idea that a pope alone is magically immune from criticism is the very idea that undermines papal authority. And no one has demonstrated this better than Pope Francis himself. You remember in one of the previous episodes we talked about the article by Mr. Palmaro, published in Italy, highly critical of this pontificate. And as a result of that article, he received a telephone call from Pope Francis, who thanked him for the criticism and said it was important that these critiques of his pontificate be published.
So if you think it's dead wrong to criticize Pope Francis, you're actually disagreeing with Pope Francis. Okay,
yeah.
That's interesting.
The Pope himself affirms the right of the faithful to make responsible criticisms of some of his words and deeds. The neo-Catholics continue to insist that the Pope is immune from criticism. That just isn't a Catholic idea. Sorry, it isn't.
So now you have criticism coming up from people who have a long and illustrious career as journalists and Catholics who are respectful men. I'm thinking of people like Pat Buchanan. Now we have Antonio Sochi, even John Allen's getting involved a little bit. This is not criticizing the Pope for the fun of it, or because we're disloyal, or because we're sedevacantist in the making. We have a situation on our hands, Chris, that things are not good right now in the Church, and things in the Vatican are perplexing for a lot of people. So to raise these questions as loyal sons of the Church shouldn't cause a problem, but it certainly does with our neo-Catholic friends.
Yeah, and this is exactly what Sochi did when he wrote these two articles. He was saying, in effect, look, open your eyes. We have an unprecedented situation here. I mean, we've seen a lot of unprecedented developments since Vatican II, but this is one of a kind in the full sense of the word. Two men contemporaneous, both in some sense having a share in the Petrine office. Another telling vignette that he points to is that when the two met at Castel Gandolfo, and when they also joined together in the ceremony for the blessing of the statue of St. Michael the Archangel, neither kissed the ring of the other. And he asked the question, who's the Pope? I mean, if Benedict viewed Francis as simply and only his successor, and himself as simply and only a mere cardinal, which is the traditional end state of other popes who resign the papacy, they become cardinals again. If he thought he was just a cardinal and Francis is truly his successor, and he was obedient and reverent towards him in the way that any subject is, he would have kissed the papal ring.
Yeah.
Anyone would.
Yeah.
So what's going on, Sochi wants to know, and I think it's a legitimate question.
I think it is, too. A lot of us are wondering what's going on, not because we want to hurl rocks or stones at our own church, but because if these things aren't clarified now, the media eventually is going to get over this honeymoon with Pope Francis, which is disingenuous to begin with. I mean, Rolling Stone magazine, for example, does not agree with Pope Francis on just about anything, from gay marriage to abortion and so forth. They exploited some of the things that he said. They used it for their own far-left liberal agenda. And so we're going to see more of that, I believe, if some of these questions are not raised in a respectful way, such as Sochi has done, and so we possibly can get some clarifications. We already got a clarification from Father Lombardi over the Rolling Stone story. So I think the Vatican is feeling the need to respond to some of this. The worst thing we can do right now is just to close our eyes and bury our head in the sand and pretend like everything's fine, because it ain't.
Well, I think we have to be prepared for some very unsettling developments over the next year. I hope I'm wrong. I hope the begins to realize what he is, and that is the Vicar of Christ, and that, as popes have done before, he begins to surprise us with a sharp turn back in the direction of tradition in the way that Pope Benedict demonstrated, even though he had limited success. That limited success worked tremendous benefits for the church. I hope you see the same thing from France.
Yeah, you know what, Chris? I hope and pray so too, but I just don't see it coming. Not at all. I know you don't either. We don't anticipate
right.
it on the human level. But I think, if you want to take this sort of conspiratorial element out of this, what we have here in Pope Francis is a man who does not want to have anything to do with the traditional liturgical patrimony of the church or a lot of the traditional ways and means that the church operated in society. This is not a conspiracy. This is what he's saying. This is what he's doing. Doesn't make him an evil guy necessarily at all. It's just that that's his worldview, and it is in contrast with tradition. It is in contrast with Benedict. And what we have, we saw this when what did he say about the traditional Mass being fashion?
Yeah, he just had an audience with a group of bishops from the Czech Republic, and the subject of the reality that young people are returning in droves to the traditional Mass came up during the conversation with the Czech bishops. Instead of expressing delight at this return to tradition by young people, which represent a greening of the church, signs of revival and growth, he said this: I find, when I search more thoroughly, it is rather a kind of fashion, meaning the old Mass. And if it is a fashion, therefore, it is a matter that does not need that much attention. It is just necessary to show some patience and kindness to people who are addicted to a certain fashion. So he's disparaging these young people. He's disparaging the 1,500-year-old liturgical tradition of the church, the Mass of the centuries, the Mass that served as the foundation of an entire civilization and culture, the Mass of the saints, the Mass that began the Second Vatican Council. He dismisses as a fashion. Now, if that 1,500-year-old rite of Mass is a fashion, what about the 50-year-old Novus Ordo? Sounds pretty fashionable to me. And if that's a fashion and the old rite is a fashion, why should he care which fashion the young people prefer?
Yeah.
What difference would it make? Yeah. And the idea that we're addicted to the traditional Mass, another of the seemingly endless series of contemptuous, disparaging, and condescending remarks he has made toward traditionalists. If we're addicted to the traditional form of Mass, what about those who go to the Novus Ordo Mass? Are they addicted to their form of worship? Is it all a matter of addictions?
That's just it, Chris. Self-loathing Catholicism, trying to take the tradition of the church and set it aside. That's all it is. Now we actually have two popes who seem to be having a little bit of a dispute over the issue of liturgical tradition.
We have one pope, a Pope Emeritus, who still has a papal coat of arms, still calls himself Benedict XVI, and who says that what was sacred then is sacred now, and you cannot abolish it, and everyone has the right to it. Then we have the other pope, the full-fledged pope, who says it's just a fashion. We've got a Janus-faced papacy. You have two heads facing in opposite directions, saying the opposite things about the same subject matter.
Yeah.
One is a Pope Emeritus, and the other is, a full-fledged pope.
Yeah.
And this is what Sochi is writing about, and this is what John Allen is taking seriously as a thorny theological problem in a sea of such problems that we're swimming in right now.
I don't enjoy this position. I find it very confusing to explain what's happening to my children. So I don't see where it's disloyal or we're the problem. We're just trying to assimilate and trying to find out what in the world is going on.
Yeah, and we have a cause for concern, as you said earlier, because there are rumors of major changes afoot in respect to the Church's discipline on divorced and remarried Catholics. And right now in Rome, they're having preliminary meetings for the October Extraordinary Synod, and one of those meetings is going to have a keynote speaker. And who is that keynote speaker?
Friend
None other than Cardinal Walter Casper. Are you kidding me? I mean, the wolf is going to give a keynote speech about what to do with the sheep.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
He wants change. He wants hope and change, baby.
It's awfully sad that we have to modify the discipline of the church so that in some way people who are living in a state of, let us face it, bigamy, can receive Holy Communion.
Yeah,
He's openly called for this, and he's giving the keynote address right now in Rome this week.
No, let's revisit that to the next Remnant Forum, because obviously that's going to be the huge news next week. And I don't know. I mean, I wish I could, again, we end these programs by wishing and hoping that we can come up with a solution. I don't know what it is, but I mean, obviously this development with Sochi and some of the Italian journalists, De Mattei and John Allen and a lot of other people indicates that we're not alone anymore in asking these questions. And so we go from here.
Well, we hear constantly the talk of schism on the part of the four bishops of the Society of St. Pius X. But as John Allen points out, there is a huge schism developing in the main body of the church between Catholics who want to overthrow everything the church has always taught and her traditional liturgy and practice, and Catholics who are saying, no, you can't do this. You're going to eviscerate the church and, to the extent that is humanly possible, destroy her.
Yeah.
There's a huge division right in the church today between these two camps of people. John Allen can see it. Antonio Sochi can see it. Traditionalists can see it. Many Catholics who are not traditionalists can see it. That's where the problem is. That's what the crisis is brewing in the church today. The Pope has to address it.
Let's just leave on that note then, Chris. That's a perfect note in which to sort of close out today's show. We are not talking about traditionalist polemics, and I really wish that some of our critical neo-Catholic friends could accept that. This is no longer a traditionalist issue. There are many people, such as the men you just ticked off on the list there, who are not traditionalists, who are asking questions. And I think more of us have got to be big boys, grow up, and ask some questions as well to try to get to the bottom of this. On that note, great to see you again. Let's chat next week, and we'll see what happens by then. If anything gets better or worse, hopefully it'll get a little better. I doubt it, but we'll see.
All right, Mike.
All right.
Take care. God
Thanks.
bless.
See you next time.